The cemetery lay still under the gray sky, a hushed silence blanketing the place as though even the wind dared not intrude. Rows of gravestones stood like silent witnesses to countless stories of love, loss, and memories now etched in stone. At the edge of the cemetery, a lone figure stood, her silhouette framed by the barren trees swaying softly in the cold breeze. Emily Dawson stood at her husband's grave, her hands lightly tracing the engraved words, "Mark Dawson. Loving husband. Devoted soldier." She didn't speak, but her lips pressed together in a way that spoke of held-back pain, of memories she wasn't ready to relive aloud. The world saw her as a grieving widow, a woman left behind, someone fragile. They couldn't have been more wrong. The breeze tugged at the edge of her black coat, but Emily didn't move. She stood rooted, as though the earth beneath her feet held her in place. Her eyes, a shade of green that seemed muted by sorrow, stared down at the grave with a quiet intensity. To an observer, she might have seemed lost in grief, but beneath that calm surface was a storm. Emily had come here today with purpose, and though she appeared alone, she wasn't. Her fingers paused on the gravestone, and she exhaled slowly, her breath visible in the cold air. "I miss you, Mark," she whispered, her voice carrying a weight of unsaid things. "But I promised you, didn't I? I promised I'd handle everything." From the distance came the low rumble of engines, faint at first but growing louder with every passing second. Emily's shoulders stiffened slightly, but she didn't look up. Not yet. The sound broke the solemn stillness of the cemetery, the engines roaring louder until they were impossible to ignore. Emily finally turned her head, her gaze calm and steady as she looked toward the source of the noise. A group of motorcycles came into view, their riders loud, careless, and brimming with arrogance. The bikers didn't belong here. Their leather jackets and patches bore insignias that screamed defiance, rebellion, and, most of all, trouble. The leader, a tall, broad man with a thick beard, parked his bike closest to the cemetery's entrance. Behind him, the others followed, their laughter echoing in sharp contrast to the solemnity of the place. Emily's eyes followed them as they dismounted and began walking toward her direction, their heavy boots crunching against the gravel path. There were 6 of them in total, each one loud and boisterous, carrying an air of confidence that bordered on entitlement. They weren't here to mourn, that much was clear. "Look at this place," one of the bikers sneered, kicking a loose rock off the path. "Creepy and boring. Why'd we stop here, anyway?" The leader smirked, his eyes scanning the area lazily before settling on Emily. "Because I wanted to." His voice was deep and commanding, carrying a tone that made it clear he wasn't used to being questioned. Emily turned her attention back to the gravestone, ignoring them completely. Her hand rested on the cold stone, as if drawing strength from it. The leader motioned toward her, a sly grin spreading across his face. "And look what we've got here. A lady all by herself." One of the younger bikers snickered. "Not just any lady. A widow, by the looks of it." Emily heard every word, but her expression didn't change. She stayed quiet, her hand sliding off the gravestone and falling to her side. The leader tilted his head, watching her closely. "Hey, sweetheart," he called out, his voice dripping with mockery. "You don't look like you belong here. Or maybe you do. Lonely graveyard, lonely woman. Makes sense." The others laughed, but Emily didn't react. Instead, she finally turned to face them, her eyes meeting the leader's with a calmness that unsettled him for just a moment. "I'm visiting my husband," she said simply. Her voice was soft, but there was a firmness in it that hinted at something deeper. The leader took a step closer, undeterred. "Your husband, huh? Let me guess. Good guy, probably fought in a war, now gone forever? Must be tough." He smirked again, glancing back at his crew as if expecting their approval. Emily's gaze didn't waver. "It is," she replied, her tone steady. Another biker, a wiry man with a scar running down his cheek, chimed in. Well, if he's not here anymore, maybe you could use some company. His words earned another round of laughter from the group. Emily's hand shifted slightly, brushing the edge of her coat, but her calm demeanor didn't falter. She studied the group quietly, as though she were making calculations in her mind. You should leave, she said finally, her voice calm but carrying an edge that made even the younger bikers glance at each other. The leader, however, wasn't impressed. He stepped even closer, invading her space with a grin that was anything but friendly. And if we don't? He asked, leaning slightly forward. Emily didn't back away. She stood her ground, her expression unreadable. Then you'll regret it, she said simply. For a moment, there was silence. The leader's smirk faltered, but only for a fraction of a second before he let out a laugh. Oh, yeah. You're going to make us regret it? What are you going to do, sweetheart? Call the cops. The others joined in, their laughter echoing across the cemetery. Emily remained still, her gaze steady as she looked at each of them in turn. She said nothing, but there was something in her eyes, a quiet determination, a strength that wasn't immediately visible but was impossible to ignore. The leader noticed it too, though he didn't want to admit it. You've got guts, he said, his tone more serious now. But guts don't mean much out here. Emily's lips curved into the faintest hint of a smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. No, she agreed, her voice low. But preparation does. The bikers exchanged confused glances, their bravado wavering slightly. The leader opened his mouth to say something, but Emily cut him off. You've made your point, she said, her tone now sharper. You've laughed, you've mocked. Now leave before you do something you can't take back. The leader's smirk returned, though it was weaker now. Or what? He challenged, his voice louder than before, as if trying to reassert control over the situation. Emily didn't answer immediately. Instead, she turned her gaze back to the gravestone, her fingers brushing over the engraved letters one last time. I promised him I'd take care of everything, she said softly, almost to herself. When she looked up again, her expression had changed. The softness was gone, replaced by something harder, something unyielding. For the first time, the leader hesitated, his confidence faltering under her unwavering stare. The tension in the air was palpable, the cemetery's silence amplifying every breath, every shift of movement. Emily stood her ground, calm and unshaken, as the bikers began to realize that perhaps they weren't as in control of the situation as they thought. The cold wind blew again, carrying with it a sense of foreboding. This wasn't just a widow standing at her husband's grave. This was a woman with a purpose, a woman who had been waiting for this moment. And the bikers were about to learn exactly how wrong they were. The leader, whose name was Jax, crossed his arms and tilted his head as he studied Emily. Her quiet defiance intrigued him, but it also irritated him. Women like her, quiet, polite, and grieving, weren't supposed to talk back. They were supposed to shrink, to disappear when people like him showed up. But this one didn't flinch. You think you're tough, huh? Jax said, his voice louder now, meant to show dominance. You're outnumbered, lady. It's just you, 6 of us, and a bunch of graves. You sure you don't want to rethink that attitude? Emily didn't reply right away. Instead, she turned her head to glance over the cemetery. Her calm, calculating expression unnerved one of the younger bikers, a wiry man with tattoos snaking up his neck. Jax, the younger man said hesitantly, maybe we should just go. This place is giving me the creeps. Jax shot him a sharp look. Shut it, Vince. Since when do you get scared of ghosts? Vince muttered something under his breath but didn't argue further. The others chuckled at his expense, but even their laughter felt a little forced now. The cold air seemed sharper, heavier, and none of them could shake the feeling that they were being watched. Emily, meanwhile, didn't move. Her calm gaze was fixed on Jax, and for a brief moment, he wondered if she was baiting him. The thought made his jaw tighten. He wasn't about to back down in front of his crew, not to some woman in a cemetery. "Fine," Jax said, stepping closer until he was just a few feet away from her. "If you're so sure of yourself, why don't you tell me what you're going to do? You're not carrying a weapon. You don't have backup. You're just standing here with that stupid gravestone." He gestured dismissively toward the marker. Emily's lips pressed into a thin line. "You don't understand, do you?" she said quietly. Jax frowned, caught off guard by her tone. "Understand what?" "That this isn't about you," she said, her voice steady and unyielding. "This is about respect. You don't belong here, and you know it. And if you're smart, you'll leave before you cross a line you can't uncross." The quiet authority in her voice sent a ripple of unease through the group. One of the older bikers, a man with a grizzled beard and a permanent scowl, narrowed his eyes at her. "Lady," he growled, "you don't get to tell us what to do. Jax, let's teach her some manners." Jax hesitated. He didn't like how calm she was. She wasn't scared, she wasn't even pretending to be scared. And there was something about the way she stood there, like she was waiting for something, or someone. "Enough of this," Vince muttered, looking around nervously. "Let's just get out of here. It's just a stupid cemetery, man. There's nothing here for us." Jax turned on him, his expression furious. "You scared of a graveyard now, Vince? Maybe you should have stayed home with your mommy." The others laughed, but the tension was thick now, hanging in the air like a storm about to break. Emily took a single step forward, drawing their attention back to her. "You think you're in control," she said, her voice calm but firm. "But you're not. Not here." Jax scoffed. "Oh yeah? And who's going to stop us?" "You." Emily tilted her head slightly, her eyes narrowing. "No. But I've been watching you, Jax. I know your type. Loud, cocky, used to getting your way. But people like you always make the same mistake." Jax raised an eyebrow, his smirk faltering. "And what mistake is that?" "You underestimate the quiet ones," Emily said simply. The words hung in the air like a challenge, and for a moment, no one moved. Jax clenched his fists, anger flashing in his eyes. He didn't like being talked down to, especially not by someone like her. "You've got guts, I'll give you that," he said, stepping even closer. "But guts don't mean a damn thing out here." Emily didn't respond. Instead, she shifted slightly, her weight balanced evenly on her feet, as if she were preparing for something. The movement was subtle, but it didn't go unnoticed by the grizzled biker. "Jax," he said warily, his voice low, "something's not right." Jax ignored him, his focus locked on Emily. He took another step toward her, his chest puffed out like a predator trying to intimidate its prey. But Emily wasn't prey. "You really don't know who I am, do you?" she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Jax frowned, confused by the question. "Why the hell should I care who you are?" Emily's lips curved into a faint smile, one that didn't reach her eyes. "You'll find out soon enough." Before Jax could respond, the sound of a branch snapping echoed through the cemetery. The bikers froze, their heads snapping toward the source of the noise. The tension in the air escalated, and for the first time, Jax felt a flicker of doubt. "What was that?" Vince whispered, his voice shaky. "Probably just an animal," Jax said gruffly, though his confidence was beginning to waver. Emily remained still, her eyes now focused on something behind them. The subtle shift in her expression, just a flicker of satisfaction, made Jax's heart pound harder than he wanted to admit. Another sound, this time closer, the crunch of footsteps on gravel. The bikers exchanged uneasy glances, their earlier bravado now replaced by a growing sense of unease. "Who's there?" Jax barked, spinning around to face the direction of the noise. The footsteps stopped, and the cemetery fell silent once again. Emily took a step back, her calm demeanor never faltering. "You've made your choice," she said softly. "Now you'll live with the consequences." Jax turned back to her, his jaw clenched. "What are you talking about? Who's out there?" Emily didn't answer. Instead, she folded her arms across her chest, her expression unreadable. The sound of footsteps resumed, louder this time, coming from multiple directions. Shadows moved among the trees at the edge of the cemetery, and the biker's unease turned to outright fear. "Jax," the grizzled biker said again, his voice shaking slightly, "we need to go." Jax turned on him, his frustration boiling over. "Shut up. No one's going anywhere." But even as he said the words, he couldn't ignore the growing sense of dread that was creeping into his chest. Something was wrong. Something was very, very wrong. Emily's voice cut through the tension like a blade. "You shouldn't have come here," she said. Her words were simple, but the weight behind them was undeniable. The bikers stood frozen, their earlier confidence shattered, as the shadows in the trees grew closer. For the first time, Jax felt real fear. And for the first time, he realized that he had underestimated her badly. This wasn't just a grieving widow standing at her husband's grave. This was someone who had been waiting for them. And she wasn't alone. The rumble of engines tore through the quiet, a jarring intrusion that made the crows nesting in the old oak trees scatter into the gray sky. Emily, still kneeling at her husband's grave, didn't move. Her hand rested on the cold stone, her fingers gently tracing the engraved letters, a ritual she performed every visit. But this time, she sensed something different. The bikers arrived in a messy formation, their roaring laughter as loud as their engines. The leader was easy to spot, a hulking man with a scruffy beard, a tattered leather vest, and a cruel smirk that hinted at the chaos he carried wherever he went. Jax. Emily had heard about him in town. A troublemaker. Dangerous. Reckless. "Look at this place!" Jax shouted over the dying roar of the engines as the bike slowed to a stop. "Like a ghost town. No one around to bother us." The group dismounted, 6 men in total, their boots crunching against the gravel paths. They walked like they owned the place, swaggering and joking as if a cemetery was the perfect spot for their twisted brand of amusement. Jax's eyes scanned the rows of headstones until they landed on Emily. "What do we have here?" he said, his voice dripping with mockery. He motioned for his crew to follow him. They surrounded her, forming a loose circle, their presence invasive and hostile. Emily didn't flinch. She didn't even look up right away. Instead, she took a steady breath, her fingers still resting on the gravestone as if drawing strength from the cold stone beneath her hand. Jax tilted his head, trying to get a better look at her face. "What's a woman like you doing out here all alone?" His buddies chuckled, the sound sharp and cruel. One of them, a wiry man with a cigarette dangling from his lips, leaned in a little closer. "Yeah, sweetheart. Ain't it a bit lonely out here? Not exactly the kind of place you'd want to get stranded." The tension in the air was palpable, but Emily remained composed. Slowly, she lifted her gaze, meeting Jax's eyes with a calmness that immediately unsettled him. "I'm visiting my husband," she said softly, her voice steady but firm. There was a weight in her tone, one that wasn't lost on Jax, though he brushed it aside. "Your husband, huh?" he said, glancing down at the grave marker. His smirk widened. "Guess he's not much for conversation anymore." His crew erupted in laughter, the sound echoing across the cemetery. Emily's jaw tightened ever so slightly, but she didn't respond to the taunt. Another biker, a broad-shouldered man with a snake tattoo winding up his arm, stepped forward and squinted at the gravestone. Dawson, he read aloud, his voice dripping with mock sincerity. To a beloved husband and a brave man. Blah, blah, blah. Real touching. Shut up, Derek, Emily said, her voice calm but cutting through the laughter like a blade. Derek froze, surprised by her boldness. The other bikers exchanged glances, their smirks faltering for a moment. Jax's amusement turned to annoyance. Well, look at that, he said, his tone hardening. She's got some fire in her. What are you gonna do, lady? Lecture us about respecting the dead? Emily stood slowly, brushing dirt from her knees. She wasn't particularly tall or physically imposing, but something about her presence made the men hesitate. She turned to face Jax, her expression unreadable. I don't need to lecture you, she said. But you should leave. Now. The command was simple, but it carried a quiet authority that caught Jax off guard. For a brief moment, he almost considered listening. But then the moment passed, and his ego kicked in. Or what? He challenged, taking a step closer. His crew followed, closing the circle around her. You gonna scare us off with that icy glare of yours? Hate to break it to you, sweetheart, but we don't scare easy. Emily didn't respond. She just looked at him, her gaze steady and unwavering. The youngest of the group, a lanky man with nervous eyes, shifted uncomfortably. Jax, maybe we should just go. This place gives me the creeps. Jax shot him a glare. What's the matter, Vince? You afraid of a couple of gravestones? The others laughed, but it was forced now. There was something about Emily that put them all on edge, even if they didn't want to admit it. Emily tilted her head slightly, studying Jax. Do you ever wonder, she said quietly, how many people regret crossing the wrong line? How many realize too late that they picked the wrong fight? Jax snorted, dismissing her words as meaningless. Lady, I think you've been watching too many movies. This ain't some dramatic showdown. It's just us having a little fun. Is that what you think this is? Emily asked. Her question hung in the air, and for the first time, the laughter stopped. There was a shift, subtle but undeniable, as the men began to realize that something wasn't right. Jax's smirk faltered, but he quickly recovered, unwilling to show any sign of weakness. Enough talking, he said. Let's teach this lady a little lesson about minding her own business. He reached out as if to grab her arm, but before he could touch her, Emily moved. It was a small, almost imperceptible step back, but it was enough to put space between them. She didn't flinch, didn't cower, she simply stood her ground with a quiet confidence that made Jax hesitate. You're making a mistake, she said calmly. Jax laughed, though it sounded forced. Oh yeah? And what's gonna stop us? You. Emily's eyes flicked past him, to the row of trees at the edge of the cemetery. For the first time, her calm facade shifted, replaced by something colder, sharper. Not just me, she said softly. Jax turned his head, following her gaze, but saw nothing. The trees stood silent, their bare branches swaying gently in the breeze. He turned back to her, irritated by the growing unease in his chest. Cute trick, he said. But it's not gonna work. Emily didn't respond. Instead, she crossed her arms, her expression unreadable. The quiet confidence in her stance made Jax's frustration boil over. All right, enough of this, he barked. You're outnumbered, lady. You don't have a weapon. You don't have backup. So why don't you drop the act and... Before he could finish, a loud snap echoed through the cemetery, cutting him off. The sound was unmistakable, the crack of a branch underfoot. The bikers froze, their eyes darting toward the source of the noise. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the faint rustle of leaves in the wind. "Who's there?" Jax demanded, his voice louder than he intended. No answer. Emily didn't move. Her gaze remained fixed on Jax, her expression calm but unyielding. Another snap, closer this time. The bikers exchanged uneasy glances, their earlier bravado crumbling under the weight of the growing tension. "Probably just an animal," Derek muttered, though his voice betrayed his uncertainty. Emily's lips curved into a faint, almost imperceptible smile. "You should have listened," she said softly. Jax's fists clenched, his frustration boiling over. "Listen to what?" he shouted. "To the warning," Emily replied, her voice steady and resolute. The atmosphere shifted again, the tension escalating as shadows began to move among the trees. The bikers, once so confident, now stood frozen, their instincts screaming at them to leave. For the first time, Jax felt the cold grip of fear. And for the first time, he realized that he had made a grave mistake. The cemetery seemed to grow colder, the air heavy with an unexplainable weight. The bikers shifted uneasily, their earlier confidence fading like a flame starved of oxygen. Jax, still trying to assert control, scoffed and spat on the ground. "Enough games," he growled, trying to sound tougher than he felt. "There's nobody here but us. You're just trying to mess with our heads." Emily tilted her head slightly, her gaze unwavering. "Am I?" Her calm demeanor only heightened the unease settling over the group. The shadows by the trees seemed to lengthen, creeping closer, though the sun hadn't moved. Another sound of faint rustling came from the direction of the woods. This time, it wasn't just a branch snapping. It was heavier, deliberate, like footsteps treading on dry leaves. "Okay, seriously, what the hell is that?" Vince, the youngest biker, muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "Shut up, Vince," Derek snapped, though his own voice trembled. Jax turned on Emily, his frustration boiling over. "I don't know what kind of trick you're pulling, lady, but it's not gonna work. We're not scared of a couple of noises." "You should be," Emily replied softly. Her voice was calm, almost gentle, but the words carried a weight that made Jax pause. She stepped closer to her husband's gravestone, resting a hand on it as though drawing strength from the name etched into the stone. The movement was subtle, but the authority in her posture was impossible to ignore. "Here's the thing about men like you," she continued, her tone measured. "You think you own every space you walk into. You think your noise, your size, your arrogance will intimidate everyone you meet. And most of the time, it probably works. But not today." Jax's face hardened. He took a step forward, closing the space between them. "You've got a big mouth for someone all alone." Emily raised an eyebrow. "Who said I was alone?" The words were spoken so casually, so matter-of-factly, that they sent a chill down Jax's spine. His eyes darted to the woods again, searching for the source of the sounds that had unsettled his crew. He saw nothing, no movement, no figures, but the unease refused to leave him. Another biker, a burly man named Tank, snorted and rolled his shoulders. "This is ridiculous. We're standing here getting spooked by some lady and a bunch of trees. Let's just get what we came for." Jax nodded, grateful for Tank's attempt to restore their bravado. "Yeah. Enough of this. Let's show her what happens when people don't respect us." But before anyone could move, another sound broke through the silence, a low, guttural growl. It wasn't the sound of an animal. It was deeper, more menacing, and it came from just beyond the tree line. The bikers froze. What was that?" Vince stammered, his hand instinctively reaching for the knife tucked into his belt. "Probably a dog," Derek said, though the tremor in his voice betrayed his uncertainty. "Does that sound like a dog to you?" Vince shot back. Emily watched them with an almost serene expression, her arms crossed over her chest. "You don't even realize what you've walked into, do you?" she said. "This isn't just any cemetery. And my husband, he's not just any man." Her words were cryptic, but the bikers couldn't ignore the conviction behind them. Even Jax, as stubborn and prideful as he was, found himself questioning the situation. The growl came again, louder this time, and accompanied by the unmistakable sound of something or someone moving closer. "Who's there?" Jax shouted, spinning toward the woods. His voice carried an edge of panic now, no longer the confident bark of a man in control. Silence. For a moment, the cemetery was still again, the only sound the faint rustling of leaves in the breeze. Then, without warning, a figure emerged from the shadows. It was a man, tall, broad-shouldered, and dressed in a dark coat that blended seamlessly with the shadows. His face was partially obscured by the brim of a wide hat, but his presence was undeniable. He didn't speak, didn't make a sound, but the intensity of his gaze was enough to send a shiver down the spine of even the bravest biker. "Who the hell are you?" Tank demanded, stepping forward aggressively. The man didn't respond. He simply stood there, his posture calm but commanding. Emily, still standing by her husband's grave, allowed the faintest hint of a smile to cross her lips. "You shouldn't have come here," she said quietly, her words directed at the bikers but carrying an almost otherworldly weight. Jax, unwilling to back down, took a step toward the man. "I don't know who you think you are, but you'd better back off before we..." Before he could finish, the man raised a hand not to strike, but as a silent command for Jax to stop. And to everyone's surprise, Jax did. He froze mid-sentence, his mouth still open, as though the very act of speaking had been stolen from him. "What the..." Derek muttered, looking between Jax and the stranger. The man finally spoke, his voice deep and resonant. "This is sacred ground. You've already disrespected it enough. Leave now, while you still can." His words weren't loud, but they carried an authority that demanded obedience. Even Tank, the most physically imposing of the bikers, hesitated. But Jax, unwilling to show weakness, shook off the momentary paralysis and clenched his fists. "You don't tell us what to do," he snarled. "We go where we want, do what we want. You think you can scare us with your little act?" The man didn't flinch. He took a slow step forward, his movements deliberate and measured. "You've been warned," he said. "What happens next is on you." Jax's frustration boiled over. He lunged at the man, his fists raised, but before he could land a blow, the stranger sidestepped him with ease. Jax stumbled, his momentum carrying him forward, and when he turned to strike again, the man was already standing several paces away, as though he had never moved. The bikers stared in disbelief. Did he just..." Vince began, but he couldn't finish the thought. Emily, still watching the scene unfold, finally spoke again. "I told you. You've made a mistake." Her words hung in the air, heavy with meaning, as the tension reached a breaking point. The bikers, once so sure of their dominance, now stood uncertain and afraid, their confidence shattered by forces they couldn't understand. And in the growing silence, the realization began to sink in. They were not in control here. The tension in the cemetery seemed to coil tighter, ready to snap. The bikers, emboldened by their numbers and convinced of their dominance, took their antics to the next level. Jax, the self-proclaimed leader, stood in front of Emily with a smug grin, his eyes gleaming with malice. He gestured to the gravestone behind her with a jerk of his chin. "So, this is where your big hero sleeps, huh?" He sneered, his voice dripping with mockery. "Looks like he's not waking up to save you anytime soon." The gang erupted into laughter, their voices echoing through the stillness of the cemetery. Emily's face remained impassive, her calmness like a stone in the middle of a raging river. Her fingers, however, tightened around the bouquet of flowers she held. It was subtle, a small gesture that went unnoticed by the bikers too focused on their performance of power. "Come on, lady," Vince said, stepping forward. He kicked at the dirt near the gravestone, sending a small cloud of dust into the air. "You've got to know how this works. You hand over what you've got, and we'll leave you in one piece." Tank, the largest of the group, let out a booming laugh. "Yeah, no need to make this harder than it has to be. You're outnumbered. Ain't nobody coming for you." Emily took a slow step back, not in retreat but as if making room, calculating her next move. Her eyes flicked over the group, scanning each man with a clinical precision they didn't notice. Then, almost imperceptibly, her gaze shifted past them, landing on their bikes parked haphazardly near the cemetery gate. "You shouldn't have done that," she said softly. Her voice was calm, too calm. The bikers paused for a moment, her tone unsettling enough to create a ripple of doubt among them. But Jax quickly brushed it off with a scoff. "Done what?" he taunted, stepping closer. He was close enough now that he could see the flowers trembling slightly in her hand, or was it her hand trembling? "You shouldn't have disrespected him," she replied, her voice steady as steel. Jax rolled his eyes. "Disrespected him? Lady, he's dead. What's he gonna do about it?" The laughter erupted again, loud and cruel, but this time, Emily's lips twitched into the faintest hint of a smile. It was so quick, so fleeting, that none of them noticed. Her free hand brushed the edge of her coat, the movement casual and unremarkable. If they'd been paying closer attention, they might have caught the way her body shifted, ever so slightly, like a predator preparing to strike. But they weren't paying attention. They thought they had her cornered. They thought she was powerless. They thought wrong. Tank, eager to prove his dominance, stepped forward and planted his boot squarely on the gravestone's base. He leaned his weight into it, as if daring Emily to object. "Bet your husband was just as weak as you," he said with a grin, kicking at the stone for emphasis. Emily's grip on the flowers tightened again, and for the first time, her expression shifted. It was subtle, a flicker of something cold and calculating in her eyes. But it was enough to make Vince hesitate, his bravado faltering. "Tank, maybe you should," Vince started, but Tank cut him off with a glare. "Shut it, Vince. She's not gonna do anything." Emily finally moved, stepping to the side and placing the flowers gently on the ground. She straightened, brushing her hands together as if dusting off dirt. When she looked up, her eyes met Tank's, and for a brief moment, the smug confidence on his face wavered. "Is that what you think?" she asked, her voice calm and measured. Tank's bravado returned in an instant. "Yeah, that's what I think. What are you gonna do about it?" Emily didn't respond. Instead, she turned her attention to Jax. "Your bikes. Do you know what's wrong with them?" Jax frowned, confused by the sudden change in topic. "What the hell are you talking about?" Emily took a slow step forward, her gaze steady. "Your bikes," she repeated, nodding toward the gate. "Something's wrong with them. Didn't you notice?" The bikers turned to look, their confidence cracking as unease crept in. The bikes sat where they'd left them, but something was different. The sunlight caught on something near the tires, shimmering droplets that hadn't been there before. "What is that?" Vince asked, his voice rising. Jax narrowed his eyes, his mind working to dismiss the growing sense of dread. "Probably just condensation," he muttered, though he didn't sound convinced. Emily tilted her head, her calm gaze never leaving Jax's. "Is that what you think?" The bikers exchanged uneasy glances, their earlier confidence rapidly eroding. Derek, the sharpest of the group, took a few steps toward the bikes, his curiosity overriding his fear. He crouched next to one of the tires and reached out to touch the liquid. When he brought his fingers to his nose, his face twisted in horror. "Gasoline," he whispered. The word hit the group like a thunderclap. "What?" Jax snapped, marching over to see for himself. He crouched next to Derek and cursed under his breath. "She's messing with us," Tank growled, though his voice lacked its earlier conviction. Emily remained where she was, her posture relaxed but her presence commanding. "You should have paid more attention when you parked," she said. "But then again, you don't strike me as the kind of men who pay attention to details." Her words carried a subtle menace that sent another ripple of unease through the group. Jax stood abruptly, his fists clenched. "Enough of this," he barked. "You think you're clever, lady? You think you can scare us with a little gasoline?" Emily didn't flinch. "I don't need to scare you," she said. "You'll do that all on your own." Before Jax could respond, a sudden hissing sound cut through the air. It was faint at first, but it grew louder, more insistent, coming from the direction of the bikes. The bikers spun around, their eyes widening as they realized what was happening. The gas tanks on their bikes were leaking faster now, the liquid pooling on the ground beneath them. "What the hell?" Vince shouted, backing away as if the bikes might explode at any moment. Jax's face twisted in rage. "What did you do?" Emily took another step forward, her calm demeanor unshaken. "I warned you," she said simply. "You didn't listen." The bikers, once so sure of their dominance, now stood paralyzed by fear and confusion. Jax, desperate to regain control, stormed toward Emily, his face a mask of fury. "You think this is funny," he snarled. "You think you're in charge here?" Emily didn't move. She didn't even blink. When she finally spoke, her voice was low and steady, cutting through Jax's bluster like a blade. "You've been in charge long enough," she said. The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. And for the first time, Jax hesitated. Jax's hesitation was fleeting. With a growl, he grabbed Emily by the arm, his grip meant to intimidate. "Enough games," he barked, shaking her slightly. "What did you do to our bikes?" Emily didn't react the way Jax expected. Instead of struggling or pleading, she simply looked down at his hand on her arm and raised an eyebrow. "That's not a smart move," she said, her voice still eerily calm. Her tone sent a chill through Jax that he quickly brushed off, but the others noticed. Tank, trying to mask his own unease, stepped forward. "Maybe we just take her with us. Let her tell us where she stashed the tools or whatever she used to mess with the bikes." Emily smiled faintly, though it didn't reach her eyes. "Take me with you," she repeated. "Do you think I'm the one who's cornered here?" The group faltered. Vince glanced back at the bikes, the puddles of gasoline growing larger beneath them. The hissing noise was louder now, and the smell of fuel was thick in the air. "Jax, maybe we should just leave," Vince muttered, his voice shaking. "Leave?" Jax snapped, his bravado flaring again. "You scared of her? She's just one woman. We're not going anywhere until she tells us what's going on." Emily tilted her head slightly, observing them like a scientist watching an experiment unfold. "You don't get it, do you?" she said softly. "What don't we get?" Jax shot back, his frustration mounting. She took a step closer to him, forcing him to either release her arm or risk looking weak. He let go, stepping back instinctively. Emily adjusted her coat, smoothing the fabric, and spoke in a tone that was almost conversational. "You think you're in control because there are 6 of you and 1 of me," she said. "Because you're bigger, louder, and used to getting your way. But numbers don't matter when you're not paying attention. And you've been too busy puffing your chests to notice the little things." Her words, calm and deliberate, landed like blows. The bikers exchanged uneasy glances, their confidence cracking further with each passing second. Tank tried to laugh, though it sounded forced. Little things. Lady, we've got the bikes, the numbers, and the firepower. You don't have squad. Emily's eyes flicked to Tank, her gaze sharp enough to make him shift uncomfortably. Do you? She asked, her tone almost curious. Derek, still crouched near the bikes, suddenly shouted, Jax, we've got a problem. What now? Jax snapped, turning toward him. The fuel lines, they've been cut. All of them. Derek's voice was high-pitched, laced with panic. The bikers froze, the realization sinking in. Their escape was gone. That's not possible, Jax muttered, stomping over to the bikes to see for himself. He crouched next to Derek, his eyes scanning the damage. The cuts were clean, precise, like they'd been made by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. Vince looked back at Emily, his face pale. She couldn't have done that. She was standing here the whole time. Emily shrugged, her calm demeanor unbroken. You're right. I didn't do it while you were watching. Her words sent a shiver through the group. They began to look around the cemetery, their eyes darting to the shadows between the trees. Was someone else here? Jax straightened, his jaw clenched. Enough of this, he bellowed, pointing a finger at Emily. I don't care how you did it. You're going to fix it, or we'll. You'll what? Emily interrupted, her voice slicing through his rant like a knife. The bikers turned to her, the shift in power becoming more apparent with every word she spoke. She wasn't pleading or panicking. She was calm, composed, and completely unafraid. Jax hesitated again, his frustration boiling over. We'll make you regret it, he said, though his voice lacked its earlier conviction. Emily took another step forward, her movements deliberate and unhurried. She was close enough now that the bikers could see the faintest trace of a smirk on her lips. Regret, she echoed, her tone light, almost amused. That's an interesting choice of words. Vince took another step back, his fear now outweighing his loyalty to Jax. Jax, this doesn't feel right, he said, his voice trembling. Shut up, Vince. Jax snapped. She's just messing with us. She doesn't have anything. Doesn't she? Derek interrupted, his voice low. All eyes turned to Derek, who was staring at Emily like he was seeing her for the first time. What are you talking about? Tank growled. Derek pointed toward the edge of Emily's coat, where the faint glint of metal was just barely visible. She's armed, he said. The group tensed, their bravado crumbling further. Jax's eyes narrowed, his mind racing. So what? One gun doesn't mean anything. Emily chuckled softly, the sound devoid of humor. Who said I only had one? Her words hung in the air like a thundercloud, and the bikers froze. For the first time, they seemed to fully grasp the situation they were in. You underestimated me, Emily said, her voice calm but carrying an unmistakable edge. You thought I was just some grieving widow. Easy prey. But you've made a mistake, one you can't take back. The bikers, who had started this encounter with arrogance and bravado, now stood uncertain and afraid. Emily's calmness, her calculated words, and her apparent preparation had turned the tables completely. Jax, desperate to salvage his authority, took a step toward her. You think you're so smart, he said, his voice trembling despite his best efforts. You think you can scare us into running away? Emily didn't answer immediately. Instead, she took another slow step forward, her presence commanding. When she spoke, her words were steady and deliberate. I don't need to scare you, she said. You've already done that to yourselves. Her gaze shifted to the bikes, then back to the group. And if you were smart, you'd start running. Because what happens next? That's not something you want to be here for. The bikers hesitated, their fear now palpable. Jax looked at his men, his authority slipping through his fingers. What's it gonna be? Emily asked, her voice soft but carrying an undeniable power. For the first time, the bikers were silent. The tension was a living thing now, pressing down on the cemetery like a storm about to break. The bikers were no longer laughing, no longer cocky. Jax clenched his fists, glancing nervously between Emily and his men. Emily stood perfectly still, the faint breeze tugging at her coat. For a long moment, she said nothing, her silence louder than any threat could have been. Then, slowly, deliberately, she reached into her coat. The bikers flinched, every eye locked on her hand. Jax barked, "What are you doing? Don't even think about." But his voice died in his throat as Emily pulled out a badge. The golden emblem glinted in the faint light, unmistakable and commanding. Her voice was steady, unyielding. "Special Forces Widow," she said, holding the badge up for all of them to see. The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. What does that mean?" Vince stammered, taking a step back. Emily's gaze settled on him, calm but piercing. "It means my husband served his country with honor. And it means I promised him I'd protect his memory, no matter what." Jax sneered, though his bravado was wavering. "A badge? That's all you've got? Lady, we're not afraid of some shiny piece of metal." Emily tilted her head slightly, her expression unreadable. "It's not the badge you should be afraid of," she said quietly. And then came the sound. At first, it was faint, barely noticeable over the pounding hearts and ragged breaths of the bikers. But it grew louder, closer. Heavy, deliberate footsteps echoed through the cemetery, each one sending a jolt of unease through the group. The bikers turned, their eyes darting toward the shadows between the trees. Figures began to emerge, one by one, moving with purpose. They were clad in dark clothing, their faces steely and focused. The glint of weapons was unmistakable in their hands. Emily's voice cut through the growing panic like a blade. "Did you really think I was alone?" The leader of the group stepped forward, his presence commanding. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and carried himself with the quiet authority of someone who had seen combat. His voice was low but firm. "Ma'am, are these the men who've been causing trouble?" Emily didn't take her eyes off the bikers. "Yes," she said simply. Tank took a step back, his bravado crumbling. "Who are they?" he hissed, his voice shaking. Emily finally smiled, though there was no warmth in it. "My husband's unit. They don't take kindly to disrespect." The bikers froze, their eyes darting between the advancing men and Emily. Jax was the first to recover, though his confidence was clearly fractured. "You think we're scared of a bunch of soldiers," he spat, though his voice lacked conviction. The leader of the group took another step forward, his gaze locking onto Jax. "You should be," he said flatly. One of the soldiers raised a hand, gesturing toward the bikers' motorcycles. "Fuel lines cut, engines sabotaged." "Nice work," he said, nodding toward Emily. She gave a faint shrug. "It wasn't hard. They weren't exactly subtle." Vince, now visibly trembling, turned to Jax. "We need to get out of here." Jax whirled on him, fury and fear warring in his expression. "How? The bikes are useless." Emily's voice drew their attention again. "You won't be leaving," she said, her tone matter of fact. Tank's voice cracked as he asked, "What are you going to do to us?" Emily took a step closer, her eyes never leaving Jax. "That depends," she said. "Are you going to apologize for what you've done?" Jax's lip curled, though his defiance was more desperate than intimidating. "Apologize? To you?" He glanced around at his men, trying to rally them. "We don't owe you anything." Emily's expression didn't change, but her voice grew colder. "You desecrated my husband's grave. You mocked his service, his sacrifice. You threatened me. And now, you stand there, surrounded, and still think you're in control. Her words landed like blows, and the bikers shrank under her gaze. The leader of the soldiers spoke up again, his tone sharp. Apologize now, or face the consequences. The bikers hesitated, fear etched into their faces. Vince was the first to crack. I'm sorry, he blurted, his voice trembling. We didn't mean any harm. Jax glared at him, but the others began to echo Vince's words, their apologies tumbling over one another in a panicked rush. Emily watched them, her expression unreadable. When they finally fell silent, she spoke again. Actions have consequences. You're lucky my husband believed in second chances. For his sake, I'll let you leave if you promise never to come back. The bikers nodded frantically, their relief palpable. But, she added, her voice hardening, if I ever see any of you again, there won't be a third chance. Do you understand? Yes, they chorused, their fear evident. The soldiers stepped aside, clearing a path. The bikers didn't waste a moment, scrambling away on foot, their confidence shattered. Emily watched them go, her posture straight and unyielding. When the last of them disappeared into the night, she let out a quiet breath. The leader of the soldiers stepped forward again, his expression softening. You handled that well, ma'am. Emily gave a faint smile. Thank you for coming. I couldn't let them get away with it. The soldier nodded. Your husband would be proud. Her gaze flicked to the gravestone, and her smile grew bittersweet. I hope so. The cemetery fell quiet again, the only sounds the rustling of leaves and the distant hum of engines as the bikers fled into the night. Emily knelt by the gravestone, her fingers brushing the etched letters. I kept my promise, she whispered. I always will. The soldiers lingered for a moment before retreating into the shadows, leaving Emily alone with the memory of her husband and the quiet triumph of justice served. The weight of the moment hung heavy in the air as the bikers stood frozen, their bravado now completely stripped away. Jax's eyes darted from the soldiers to Emily, his usual confidence dissolving like smoke. Listen, Jax began, his voice trembling as he raised his hands in mock surrender. This has all been a big misunderstanding. We didn't mean any harm. Emily's lips curved into a faint, humorless smile. Misunderstanding? You mocked my husband's grave. You threatened me. And now, you think you can talk your way out of this. Tank, the largest of the bikers, took a shaky step forward, his voice a mix of fear and bravado. Kman, lady. We didn't know who you were. If we'd known, we wouldn't have. Emily cut him off with a sharp, icy tone. You wouldn't have what? Bullied someone else? Desecrated another grave? Her voice dropped lower, each word hitting like a hammer. You're only sorry because you got caught. The soldiers behind her fanned out, their presence imposing. They moved with precision, their training evident in every step. The leader of the group, a man with graying hair and a face etched with experience, took a step forward, addressing Emily. What do you want us to do with them, ma'am? The biker's eyes widened in panic. Vince, the youngest of the group, dropped to his knees. Please. Don't hurt us. We'll do whatever you want. Emily's gaze turned to him, cold and calculating. For a long moment, she didn't speak, letting the silence stretch until the weight of it became unbearable. Then she stepped forward, standing just inches from Vince. Whatever I want, she echoed, her voice quiet but razor sharp. What I want is for you to understand what you've done. What I want is for you to realize that actions have consequences. Jax tried to interject, his voice shaky but defiant. Look, we'll pay for the damage. We'll fix the grave. Emily turned to him sharply, her eyes blazing. You think this is about money? You can't buy back respect. You can't undo the disrespect you've shown with a check. This is about honor, Something you clearly know nothing about. As Emily spoke, the soldiers began to act. One moved toward the bikers' motorcycles, inspecting the damage Emily had already inflicted. Fuel lines are cut clean, he observed, nodding in approval. Another soldier crouched near the dirt the bikers had kicked over the grave, scooping up a handful and letting it fall back to the ground. You made a mess here, the soldier said, his voice flat. You're going to clean it up. Jax's face twisted in indignation. You're kidding me? Emily raised an eyebrow. Do I look like I'm kidding? One of the soldiers stepped forward, his towering frame casting a shadow over Jax. You heard her. Get to work. The bikers hesitated, looking at each other for reassurance. When no one moved, Emily gave a small nod, and the soldiers stepped closer, their stances menacing. Vince scrambled to his feet and grabbed a handful of dirt, frantically trying to clean the gravestone. I'm doing it. I'm doing it. The others followed suit reluctantly, muttering curses under their breath. Emily stood back, her arms crossed, watching them with a steely gaze. Jax was the last to join in, his pride clearly warring with his fear. He shot Emily a venomous look as he crouched down to help, but she didn't flinch. Instead, she stepped closer, her voice dropping to a near whisper. You think you're tough because you ride a bike and push people around, she said. But real toughness is about standing for something. Protecting something. You wouldn't last a day in my husband's world. Jax's jaw tightened, but he said nothing, his hands trembling as he worked. When the bikers finished cleaning, they stood awkwardly, dirt-streaked and humbled. The soldiers remained in a loose circle around them, their expressions unreadable. Emily stepped forward, her boots crunching against the gravel. You've done the bare minimum to show respect, she said, her tone sharp. But this doesn't erase what you've done. It doesn't erase the pain you caused. And it doesn't mean you're off the hook. Jax's head shot up, panic flashing in his eyes. What else do you want from us? Emily tilted her head, considering him. What I want is for you to think long and hard about the choices that brought you here. I want you to remember this night every time you feel the urge to intimidate someone. And most of all, I want you to understand that if you ever come near the cemetery again, there won't be anyone here to give you a second chance. Her words were like a death sentence, and the bikers visibly recoiled. The leader of the soldiers stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. You've been given a warning. Don't make us come looking for you. Vince nodded frantically, his face pale. We won't. We swear. Jax looked like he wanted to argue, but a sharp glare from Emily silenced him. Get out of my sight, she said. The bikers didn't need to be told twice. They stumbled over themselves as they fled the cemetery, their footsteps echoing in the still night. As the last of them disappeared into the darkness, Emily let out a slow breath. She turned to the soldiers, her expression softening. Thank you for coming. The leader gave her a small nod. You handled yourself well. Your husband would have been proud. Emily's gaze shifted to the gravestone, her hand brushing against the engraved letters. I hope so, she murmured. The soldiers began to disperse, their presence fading into the shadows as quickly as they had appeared. Emily was left alone with the stillness of the night and the quiet strength that had carried her through. She knelt by the grave, placing a hand on the cool stone. I kept my promise, she whispered. They'll never forget tonight. And neither will I. The wind stirred around her, carrying with it the faint scent of the flowers she had laid at the grave. For a moment, it felt as though she wasn't alone, that the spirit of her husband was there, watching, proud. Emily stood, her shoulders square and her chin high. She had faced the storm and emerged stronger. As she walked away, the cemetery returned to its peaceful silence, a place of honor and memory once more. Would you like me to refine or add any specific details to this section? The dawn crept over the horizon, washing the cemetery in a soft golden light, but the peace Emily had fought so hard to reclaim wasn't fully restored yet. The bikers, once so sure of their dominance, were now the picture of shame and defeat. Their gang's roar had been silenced, replaced with the clink of handcuffs and the low murmurs of law enforcement. A police cruiser pulled up near the cemetery gates, its lights flashing in the early morning gloom. The officers who emerged wore expressions of grim determination as they approached the group. Jax, the gang's leader, turned to Emily one last time, his face twisted in defiance that was quickly overshadowed by fear. "You think this is over," he sneered, his voice low but trembling. "You'll regret this, lady." Emily didn't flinch. Her gaze was unwavering, calm but filled with quiet authority. "The only regret I have is letting people like you think they can do whatever they want without consequence." Jax's bravado crumbled further as an officer stepped in front of him, reading him his rights with a voice as cold and steady as steel. The rest of the gang was corralled by the other officers, their leather vests and tattoos now looking more like hollow symbols of a broken empire. Tank, the burly second in command, tried to plead his case, his voice hoarse. "Look, we didn't mean for things to go this far. It was just some fun, you know. We weren't gonna hurt anyone." One of the officers, a no-nonsense woman with a sharp gaze, snapped her notebook shut and leveled him with a glare. "Desecrating graves, destruction of property, intimidation. Does that sound like harmless fun to you?" Tank opened his mouth to argue, but no words came out. His shoulders sagged, and he looked at the ground. Emily, standing a few feet away, watched the scene unfold with quiet satisfaction. For a moment, she caught the eye of Vince, the youngest of the bikers, whose face was pale and streaked with dirt. He opened his mouth as if to speak but quickly looked away, his shame too great to confront her directly. As the bikers were led to the waiting cruisers, Emily approached one of the officers, the same one who had taken Jax into custody. He looked at her with a mix of admiration and respect. "You want to press charges for everything?" he asked. Emily paused, her gaze shifting to the gravestone where her husband's name was etched into the cold stone. She thought of the years she had spent grieving, rebuilding, and training herself to be ready for moments like this. "No," she said at last, her voice firm but measured. "They'll face justice for what they did here, but this is bigger than me. They need to understand what respect means not just to me but to everyone they've hurt before this." The officer nodded. "Understood. We'll take it from here." Jax was shoved into the back of the cruiser, his face still twisted with indignation. As the door slammed shut, he glared at Emily through the window. "This isn't the end, lady," he growled. "You can't scare us forever." Emily took a step closer, her eyes locking onto his with an intensity that made him flinch. Her voice was low but sharp enough to cut through the tension like a knife. "This isn't about fear. It's about respect. And if you haven't learned that by now, you'll learn it the hard way." As the cruisers pulled away, the cemetery grew quiet once more. The stillness was no longer tense or foreboding but peaceful, as it was meant to be. Emily turned back to the gravestone, her shoulders relaxing for the first time since the night began. The soldiers who had stood by her side began to disperse, their mission complete. The grizzled leader of the group approached Emily, his expression softening. "You handled that well," he said, his voice gruff but kind. Emily gave him a small nod. "I couldn't have done it without your help." "Thank you." He shook his head. "Your husband would be proud. You didn't just stand your ground, you honored his memory." As he walked away, Emily was left alone with the gravestone. She knelt beside it, brushing away the last bits of dirt that clung to its surface. The bouquet of flowers she had brought earlier lay untouched, a symbol of life and love amidst the somber stone. "I told you I'd protect this place," she murmured, her fingers tracing the engraved letters of her husband's name. "I kept my promise." News of the bikers' arrest spread quickly in the small town. Stories of their misdeeds began to surface: intimidation, vandalism, and worse. For too long, they had operated unchecked, but Emily's actions had lit a fire under the local authorities. Investigations were reopened, charges piled up, and their reputation crumbled. In the days that followed, the cemetery saw an influx of visitors, not to gawk but to pay their respects. Word had spread about what Emily had done, and people came to honor the courage she had shown. One elderly woman approached Emily as she stood by her husband's grave one afternoon. The woman's eyes were filled with tears. "My husband is buried here too," she said softly. "For years, I was too afraid to come visit. But what you did. You've made this a safe place again. Thank you." Emily smiled, her heart swelling with a quiet pride. "It's what he would have wanted," she said, glancing at the gravestone. As the weeks turned into months, the cemetery returned to its serene, undisturbed state. The bikers were gone, their reign of intimidation shattered. Emily found herself visiting her husband's grave more often, not out of sadness but as a way to reflect on the journey she had taken. One day, as she stood there, a young girl approached her timidly. The girl couldn't have been more than 10, clutching a small bouquet of wildflowers. "Are you the lady who scared the bad guys away?" the girl asked, her eyes wide with curiosity. Emily chuckled softly, kneeling to the girl's level. "I didn't scare them," she said gently. "I just reminded them what's right." The girl nodded solemnly, placing the flowers at a nearby grave before running back to her family. As Emily watched her go, she realized something profound: her strength didn't just lie in what she had done that night. It lay in the example she had set, in showing that standing up for what's right could ripple out, touching lives in ways she hadn't even imagined. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, Emily stood by the gravestone once more. This time, she wasn't alone. A small gathering of people stood nearby: friends, neighbors, even strangers who had heard her story. They had come not for her but for what she represented: resilience, respect, and an unwavering sense of justice. Emily placed a final bouquet at the grave, her hand lingering on the cool stone. "Rest easy," she whispered. "Your legacy is safe." As she walked away, the wind carried her words through the quiet cemetery, a promise kept and a memory honored. The place was sacred again, and so was her peace. Would you like me to refine any part of this, or does it feel complete to you? The sun had finally set, casting long shadows over the cemetery. The quiet of the place was no longer oppressive but peaceful, as if the land itself had exhaled a sigh of relief. Emily Dawson stood alone at her husband's grave, her figure silhouetted against the fading light, her expression calm yet resolute. The battle, in many ways, had been won, but the war was never just about revenge. It was about something deeper. Something more meaningful. As she gazed at the gravestone, the memories of the past few days flooded her mind. The bikers, their arrogance, their cruel mockery of her husband's memory. It had all been so sudden, so unexpected. They had thought they could walk in, threaten her, and get away with it, like they had countless times before with others. What they didn't understand, what they couldn't understand, was that Emily was not the kind of woman who would back down. She had spent years learning how to fight, how to protect, how to defend what mattered most. Not just with weapons, but with something far stronger: her heart. It wasn't the size of the fight that mattered. It wasn't the loudness of the threats or the force behind the words. It was the strength of her resolve, the unwavering belief that love, respect, and dignity were worth fighting for. For most people, Emily had been invisible. Just a quiet widow in mourning, someone who didn't make a fuss, who lived her life in the background. She hadn't asked for attention, and yet, when the time came, it was her quiet strength that had saved the day. She had known, deep down, that there were people in this world who would test her, who would try to break her. But those people, like the bikers, had underestimated her. They had seen only the outward appearance, the grief-stricken woman at her husband's grave. They hadn't seen the years of preparation, the knowledge she had gained, the inner strength she had cultivated. Strength, she had learned, didn't always show itself in loud moments. It wasn't in the anger you felt when you were wronged, or the pride you took in your victories. True strength, she realized, was silent. It was in the quiet moments of decision, in the calm before the storm. It was knowing when to stand your ground and when to let your actions speak for you. And in that cemetery, Emily had done just that. It wasn't easy, of course. No one who fights for what they believe in ever finds the path simple. But Emily had learned that resilience wasn't about being unshakable. It wasn't about never feeling fear, never feeling doubt. Resilience was about pushing forward even when you were afraid. It was about refusing to let life, or people, take away your power. When the bikers had first appeared, Emily had been surrounded by their mocking laughter, their threats, their arrogance. But deep down, she knew what they didn't. They had no idea who they were messing with. They hadn't known that she wasn't just a widow. She was a woman who had fought for her life once before, and she wasn't about to let anyone destroy what she had built. Not even them. Resilience, Emily had learned, came from knowing your worth and never letting anyone define it for you. It came from knowing that even when you felt small or weak, you were never truly powerless. You had the strength within you to fight back, to rise up when others pushed you down. The bikers who had dared to disrespect her husband's grave had faced consequences, yes. They had been arrested, their gang dismantled, their reign of terror ended. But for Emily, the true victory wasn't in the retribution, it was in the justice that had been served, not just to the bikers but to the memory of her late husband. She had promised him that she would always protect his name, his honor, his legacy. And she had kept that promise. Justice, she knew, was not always about punishment. It wasn't about vengeance or making people suffer for the wrongs they had committed. Justice was about balance. It was about restoring what was broken, protecting the innocent, and ensuring that respect was always upheld. In this case, it was about ensuring that her husband's memory would not be tarnished by those who saw it as nothing more than a target. And in that moment, as the bikers were hauled away in handcuffs, Emily knew that justice had been served. It had been hard, and it had been messy, but it had been right. She had stood her ground, fought for what she believed in, and come out victorious. And in doing so, she had honored her husband's memory in the most profound way possible. There was something deeply satisfying about watching the bikers taken away in those police cars. Something that made Emily feel, for the first time in a long while, that the world was a little bit more just. But as the police left, taking the bikers with them, and as the cemetery settled back into its quiet state, Emily felt a deep sense of peace. The world would continue on, with or without her. People would continue to go about their lives, some doing right, others doing wrong. But Emily knew that her actions had sent a message. To the bikers, to the people who had been watching, and to herself. That message was simple: no one, no matter how big or tough they thought they were, was above respect. And those who thought they could take it for granted would learn the hard way. Because the truth was, Emily wasn't just defending her husband's memory. She was defending the very idea of respect itself. She was standing up for everyone who had ever been overlooked, silenced, or disrespected. She was saying, "I will not let this stand." And that, in itself, was the most powerful thing she could do. As Emily turned to leave the cemetery, the light of the setting sun casting long shadows at her feet, she reflected on everything that had led her to this moment. The years of hardship. The loss. The loneliness. The quiet moments of despair that only someone who had truly loved could understand. But through it all, love had been the one constant. Not just the love she had for her husband, but the love she had for justice, for what was right. And that love had been the source of her strength. It had given her the courage to face the bikers, to stand tall in the face of fear, to never back down. She knew, deep in her heart, that love was the most powerful force in the world. It could heal wounds, it could rebuild lives, and it could give people the strength to face the darkest moments. Love was what made the world worth fighting for. And for Emily Dawson, love was what had helped her defeat the darkness. Sometimes, it's not the size of the fight in a person, it's the strength of their resolve, Emily thought, as she walked away from the grave, her steps sure and steady. The lessons she had learned, the battles she had fought, had shaped her into someone far stronger than she had ever imagined. Emily Dawson wasn't just a widow. She wasn't just someone who had lost the love of her life. No, she was so much more. She was a reminder that strength doesn't always come from power or force. It comes from the heart. From the ability to rise above fear, to fight for what's right, and to never, ever give up. And for anyone who thought they could take that away from her or from anyone else, Emily's message was clear: they would learn the hard way.